my topic today is to try to combine both the political aspect as well as an introduction in general about aspect of Islam that motivate aspect of U.S. foreign policy. Now, I combined oil and God together, and for many people to say oil and God are together, very problematic, but I do believe that they go hand in hand, especially in the current parts of U.S. foreign policy. Now, a British officer was quoted in The Guardian, and in preparation to go to Iraq, he said, "I read T.E. Lawrence." T.E. Lawrence, if you don't know, was the main figure during the First World War that convinced the British to have a southern plan for their war with the Ottoman. And he was an intelligence officer stationed in Egypt, convinced the British to undertake a mission to Mecca to convince Sharif Hussein, the ruler of Mecca, to join the British in the invasion. So in preparing for his deployment in Iraq, he said, "I read T.E. Lawrence before I came here." A century ago, he recognized dishonesty was inherent in Arab society. Right? So he's actually preparing himself. Then he goes on to say, "They do nothing for love and nothing at all if they can help it." Now, I'm starting with this aspect of this British officer in his early deployment to say that what we have is an inherent discrimination, inherent racism that is still permeates some of our views relative to the Middle East. Now, I am mentioning this once again to set up our view of the Middle East. Our primary reason for being in the Middle East is one thing and one thing only. It's oil. Today, if you didn't hear the news, it's about $100 plus. If the Middle East did not produce oil and only produce peanuts, possibly only President Carter would have been concerned about having a foreign policy dedicated to the Middle East. Why oil? Because oil is the main ingredient for our industrial base and the industrial base for much of the Western society and the engine that makes possible our industrialization and globalization to move forward. Now, if you realize, I'm speaking to you in a microphone, that's electricity, that's oil. I'm standing on a stage that is made of oil pipe products. This computer is functioning on aspects of oil with the subparts that are there. The ground that you're sitting on, the chairs, the light, everything that is possible today between me and you here in this lecture has been made possible by oil. Now, in the Second World War, the major prize of the Second World War was not Western Europe. It was not Western Europe. It wasn't to set up the curtain, the Iron Curtain between us and Eastern Europe. The prize of the Second World War was the Middle East. Whoever controlled the Middle East had a considerable weight to play in relations to global political structures. That's why we opposed the Soviet Union, and we constantly engaged in attempting to prevent the Soviet Union during the Cold War from laying a hand on the Middle East. Now, when we speak of the Cold War, we only speak of the Cold War relative to us and the Soviet Union. There was a Cold War in the Arab world. There was a Cold War in the Arab world. The Cold War in the Arab world pitted what we call the Arab nationalists. And if we remember the Arab nationalists, I know I'm going to throw names that we don't know because they're foreigners, right? Jamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser of Egypt was a new Arab ruler who came in with a nationalist identity. His nationalist identity said that the Arab resources should be controlled by Arabs and should be put for the service of their own people. At the same time Nasser came into power, 1953, we also had a nationalist person in the guise of Mossadegh of Iran, who was the prime minister. Likewise, Mossadegh in Iran came with the idea that the oil resources that are in Iran should be for the benefit of the Iranian, and it should be nationalized. Prior to that, Iranian oil was controlled by the British. Actually, the Iranians get pennies on each barrel of oil that was produced in Iran, and the British were in complete control of their oil infrastructure. Mossadegh, who was seen as an early Democrat, quote unquote, not any connection to Obama or Clinton, but was seen as an early democratic movement in Iran, nationalized the oil. Now, the US, even though it was not directly involved at the time, we saw this as a threat. So we dispatched our own services, intelligence services. We sent a person by the name of Kermit Roosevelt, the grandson of the President Roosevelt. We sent him with $300,000 to foment a rebellion in Iran, thus turning a society that was moving deliberately toward a nationalist identity, reversed the nationalist movement in Iran, and brought back the Shah, who was already in Italy shopping at the time, brought him back and installed him back in his throne in Iran in 1953. That's the same year that Nasser regime came into existence in Egypt as a nationalist regime. The same, in 2 or 3 years after that, we also had a Syrian regime with the nationalist credentials, and Iraq itself had a revolution that removed the monarchy, which was set up in there by the British post the First World War. And by 1956, 57, 58, we have 3 or 4 major nationalist regimes coming with nationalist credentials and focusing on the resources, oil being the main resource. Egypt also wanted to have control of the Suez Canal in 1955, 56. That resulted in a response from the US and Western Europeans. Now, unbeknown, this is what's called the Arab Cold War. The Arab Cold War. Now, the US leaned on the monarchies. The US leaned on the monarchies. The monarchies in the guise of Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Jordan, Morocco. And what we had is a nationalist monarchist, right, Cold War that developed over a period of almost 30 years. The monarchists were allied with the US, and the nationalists were allied or forced into alliance with the Soviet Union, even though that they were making overtures toward the US to try to see if they could strike some type of agreement with the United States vis-a-vis the Europeans.